The effigy lay sprawled across the two vicarage chairs like some ungainly guest who had drunk too freely and insisted upon staying. Its sackcloth head, painted with a few clumsy strokes of ink, looked blankly at the ceiling as though waiting for applause that would never come. Inspector Perbrite regarded it with the same patience he reserved for most of the town's minor upheavals. His gaze travelled over the rope, neatly knotted, perhaps too neatly for schoolboy mischief, and settled upon the card pinned askew upon the chest. "Judgment," it read in heavy, uneven capitals. He leaned a little closer, but refrained from touching. Instead, he rocked back on his heels, expression betraying nothing more than a faint curiosity. The vicar, twisting his hands as though in perpetual prayer, ventured, "A cruel jest, Inspector."
"Very cruel, though I suppose
one ought to be relieved that it is only straw." "Yes," Perbrite murmured. "It would have been very inconvenient if it were not." His tone suggested mild reflection upon parish housekeeping rather than outrage at blasphemy. The vicar, accustomed to more obvious sympathy, appeared unsure how to proceed. "We have, had visitors, of course, a number of people from outlying villages, though one would not expect such persons to make free with the churchyard trees." Perbrite nodded without commitment. He crouched, examined the effigy's boots, scuffed, genuine leather, rather than cast-offs from a fancy-dressed chest. Their size was not generous. "You don't recall noticing anyone carrying something bulky through the gate this morning?" "Not I," replied the vicar, a little too eagerly. Then, after reflection, "One of the vergers mentioned a man loitering by the porch quite early, but people often do. It affords shade." "Of course," said Perbrite, as though shade were an unanswerable alibi. The effigy was carried away shortly afterwards by a constable who seemed grateful to be seen doing something physical. Perbrite remained in the vicarage, sipping the proffered tea with careful politeness. He asked questions that sounded incidental: who had opened the churchyard gates, whether the boiler repairman had been expected, if the Women's Institute had had access for their flower arrangements. Each query emerged as casually as one might ask about the weather, yet left the vicar struggling to keep track of what was being gathered. Outside, the disturbance was still in full voice. The flower show, deprived of its audience, sagged into indignation. Mrs. Glossop declared it an outrage upon roses everywhere, though nobody asked her to elaborate. Councillor Ruddlesden held forth on the depravity of modern youth, embellishing his account of first discovery with dramatic additions that grew with each retelling. By dusk, his version included the detail of a sinister whistle echoing among the gravestones, a flourish that seemed to delight his listeners as much as it annoyed them. Perbrite, however, asked no more. As he left the vicarage, he paused briefly in the churchyard. The lime tree's branch, still bent from its recent burden, swayed lightly in the evening breeze. To anyone else it was an end to an ugly jest. To Perbrite, it was the beginning of a small puzzle. Who in a town so cautious about appearances would go to the trouble of fashioning a hanged man and leaving him wordlessly behind? He looked once more at the branch, then at the gathering dusk before strolling away with the calmness of a man who knew that time and gossip would loosen more tongues than force ever could. By the following morning, Flaxborough's collective imagination had been fertilized to such a degree that scarcely a shop, parlour, or taproom was free of speculation. The effigy in the churchyard, once a crude bundle of straw and old clothes, had blossomed in rumour into half a dozen sinister shapes. Each retelling carried its own embellishments: a note pinned to the chest in Latin, a sack daubed with blood rather than ink, a pair of boots recognizable as belonging to a departed alderman. At Hibblethwaite's drapery, customers queuing for pins and cotton spoke in earnest about the foreign element. One woman, with a firm grasp of very little but her shopping basket, declared it must be the work of itinerants from the fairground, who were known to dabble in peculiar ways. A younger voice countered that such melodrama belonged not to wanderers, but to radicals at the technical college, a nest of long-haired boys who disliked authority and, in all probability, chrysanthemums. In the snug of the Lamb and Flag, the talk was less about politics and more about insult. The caricature, said one man over his pint, had clearly been meant to represent Councillor Ruddlesden himself. The girth, the scuffed boots, the sagging posture, all too obvious. Another countered that the effigy was more like Mr. Sproul, the solicitor, whose air of judgment upon everyone else could certainly provoke this sort of revenge. Neither view was allowed to settle long before a third drinker declared the whole thing pointed to old animosities within the church choir, where rivalries over solos had festered for years. In Mrs. Fawcett's tea-room, where gossip was kneaded into every scorn, the effigy's message of judgment was interpreted as biblical warning. By 11 says she was convinced it presaged the imminent collapse of society, beginning naturally with Flaxborough. The young waitress, who had overheard enough apocalyptic mutterings to sour the teapots, remarked tartly that the word might have been directed only at Mr. Fawcett's custard tarts. Meanwhile, the Women's Institute, flushed with the indignation of guardianship, assembled an impromptu committee. Their minutes, recorded with practised solemnity, concluded that while the effigy was undoubtedly a disgrace, it also demonstrated the continuing need for vigilance against permissive trends. Mrs. Glossop added that it might also serve as a reminder to those who entered begonias in the wrong category, though this suggestion was tactfully omitted from the record. Councillor Ruddlesden himself proved tireless in interpreting the incident as evidence of declining moral standards. He recounted for the local press, and for anyone else trapped within earshot, the precise moment of discovery. Each narration grew more dramatic than the last. First, he had simply seen it. Then he had approached under a sensation of dread. Finally, by late afternoon, he was insisting that the effigy had swayed ominously towards him, like a warning finger from the grave. Mortimer of the Argus, notebook in hand, recorded this with the expression of a man certain that exaggeration was the oxygen of civic life. To colleagues later, he muttered that the councillor seemed almost disappointed there was no body inside. Perbrite, meanwhile, passed the day with studied calm. He had spoken little since his first examination of the figure, and less still about what he thought of it. Those who encountered him about town observed his polite nod, his patient ear, but received no more than mild agreement to their wilder conjectures. If pressed, he would merely suggest that pranks were known to flourish in late summer, when idle hands were too warm for work. Yet his eyes, steady and thoughtful, revealed that he was already listening for discordant notes in the town's chorus. By evening, the gossip had swollen to a kind of pageant. Children played games of hangman in the street with sticks and string. Housewives speculated whether they ought to double-lock their doors against masked intruders. The town's air of comic alarm hovered on the edge of something more uneasy. For if an effigy could be hung so brazenly in the vicar's own garden of graves, what, people wondered, might be strung up next? Inspector Perbrite began his inquiries in the mildest of fashions, for he had long understood that nothing caused respectable citizens to divulge so much as the opportunity to do so under the guise of helpfulness. His first call was to the vicar once more, who received him with the air of a man both embarrassed by notoriety and faintly pleased to be at the centre of it. The study still carried a scent of damp hymnals, and the effigy's absence from its resting chairs left a peculiar vacancy. The vicar insisted that he had locked the churchyard gates the previous evening at dusk. No one had access to the keys except himself, the verger, and one of the churchwardens. And, of course, he added hastily, none of them would dream of, well, this sort of thing. He spoke as though the mere thought of impugning church functionaries was a sacrilege. Perbrite smiled politely, noting that the lock had shown no damage, nor indeed any mark at all. Next he called upon Councillor Ruddlesden. who welcomed him with a theatrical gravity better suited to the unveiling of a war memorial. Ruddlesden led him into a dining room upholstered as heavily as its owner and launched without prompting into a blow-by-blow account of his discovery. Each sentence ballooned with adjectives, and Perbrite had the look of a man attending an overlong sermon, occasionally interjecting a gentle, "Indeed," or "I see." When asked whether he had noticed anyone loitering near the churchyard before his discovery, Ruddlesden declared that he had seen shadowy figures, possibly foreigners, though when pressed, he admitted these may have been pigeons disturbed by his tread. Perbrite allowed the counsellor's performance to conclude, then inquired mildly whether he recognized the clothes worn by the effigy. Ruddlesden hesitated only long enough to appear certain of his next declaration. They had been unmistakably council attire, though the inspector privately recalled they were nothing more than a shabby black jacket and trousers of indeterminate vintage. Satisfied that further questions would yield only new embellishments, Perbrite departed with thanks, leaving the counsellor basking in the importance of his role. His next visit was to Mrs. Glossop, who received him in a parlour overrun with framed certificates of floral merit. She spoke with brisk indignation of hooliganism and hinted darkly that her neighbour's nephew, a boy with no respect for begonias, could not be ruled out. Yet when Perbrite gently inquired whether she had seen or heard anything suspicious, she admitted she had slept soundly and woken only to discover her roses had once again been overlooked by the judges. The matter of effigies was of secondary concern to her, and soon she was reciting the injustices of past flower shows until Perbrite, still smiling, excused himself at the Argus office. Mortimer was waiting with a notepad thick with speculation but lean on fact. The reporter, who had already spent the day harvesting opinions in public houses, offered the inspector his balanced view. It was, Mortimer explained, undoubtedly a prank of political kind. Students were behind it, they always are, and the word judgment could be nothing less than a revolutionary slogan. Perbrite remarked that the lettering resembled the sort produced by a blunt school pen rather than a manifesto printer. Mortimer looked faintly disappointed. By evening, Perbrite had accumulated a portfolio of contradictions. A gate, said to have been locked, yet apparently opened. An effigy claimed to wear counsellor's garb, though plainly dressed in discarded suit-cloth. An outraged town that insisted everyone else was guilty but themselves. None of it amounted to more than fragments, yet he tucked them carefully away in the drawers of his mind. He walked back to the station through streets that still buzzed with conjecture, his expression calm, his pace unhurried, as though all he had heard were no more than variations on the weather forecast. The townsfolk, seeing him pass, felt reassured that the police were,
at last, engaged.
but Perbrite, behind his mild eyes, was less convinced by their certainties. He had heard too many stories told too eagerly, and it was eagerness, he reflected, that so often concealed the most useful truths. It was inevitable that Councillor Ruddlesden would promote himself as the town's chief interpreter of events. By the second morning he had already arranged a private audience with the mayor, not so much to inform as to guide opinion. He declared, with all the pomp of a judge delivering sentence, that the culprit could only be one of the so-called radicals from the technical college. These young men, he insisted, were known for their insolence, their long hair, their noisy guitars, and their disdain for public order. It was no leap, therefore, to suppose they had progressed from loud music to subversive effigies. The mayor, who was chiefly concerned with securing his re-election, nodded gravely, while inwardly hoping that any scandal might be resolved without implicating the council. Ruddlesden pressed harder. The effigy's boots, he said, were not ordinary boots at all, but belonged to some theatrical costume, and he had it on authority that the college possessed a wardrobe of such things. He could not, when questioned, name the authority, though he hinted that his information came from a very good quarter indeed. By midday, the councillor's version of truth had already filtered into public talk. At the market stalls, women speculated about that gang of lads who lounged in cafes instead of seeking respectable employment. At the butcher's, a remark was made that one of them had once been seen carrying rope. The notion of student subversives hung about the town as thickly as the smell of frying fish. Mortimer of the Argus, ever ready to fan embers into headlines, visited Ruddlesden to collect a statement. He departed with several pages of the counsellor's theories, most of which were unprintable without risk of libel, but which lent themselves nicely to hints of youthful unrest. The evening edition carried a discreet piece suggesting that certain influences were seeking to undermine public decency. Inspector Perbrite, however, listened to all this with a face of gentle neutrality. When the superintendent, pressed by the mayor, suggested that the police might at least have a word with the principal of the technical college, Perbrite agreed with mild civility. He and Sergeant Love were dispatched to the campus, where the principal, a weary man whose spectacles appeared permanently fogged, received them with long-suffering patience. He assured the inspector that his students, while sometimes noisy, were incapable of such theatrics as had appeared in the churchyard. Their rebellions, he said dryly, rarely extend beyond demands for more comfortable chairs. When shown the word judgment written upon the card, he remarked that his students, if guilty, would have added at least a dozen exclamation marks. He was perfectly willing, however, to let the police inspect the theatre department stores. The stores yielded little but dust and forgotten costumes. None of the shoes resembled the effigy's worn boots, and the wardrobe mistress, affronted at the implication, declared that no self-respecting student would risk rain damage to her garments by leaving them in a tree overnight. Sergeant Love, who had expected excitement, found only mothballs and irritation. Back in his office, Perbrite reported the visit without flourish. The superintendent frowned, unused to being denied a neat resolution. "But Ruddlesden seems certain," he muttered. "Yes," Perbrite replied gently, "and certainty is a very serviceable coat. It can be worn in all weathers, though it does not always fit." He allowed the remark to settle without elaboration, and turned back to his paperwork as though the matter required no further urgency. Yet beneath his calm exterior, he had already noted how swiftly suspicion had been herded toward a group that could neither easily defend itself nor retaliate. It was, he reflected, an old habit of small towns to drape blame upon the shoulders of the unfamiliar, while carefully folding away their own garments of guilt. Inspector Perbrite had learned to distrust the comfort of tidy suspects. Whenever a town arrived too quickly at a culprit, he suspected less a sudden burst of communal insight than a collective wish to be done with discomfort. And so, while Councillor Ruddlesden broadcast his certainty about students, Perbrite continued his small, unhurried observations. One such observation came during a return stroll through the parish hall, where the remnants of the flower show still lingered. Tables were being cleared of drooping blooms, prize cards gathered into untidy piles, and a faint smell of damp petals pervaded the air. The hall was almost deserted, but the inspector paused before a long table of dahlias, still adorned with the little labels denoting class and owner. It was here he noticed a curious thing. Among the scattered cards lay one that had evidently been displaced, its pin still skewered with a shred of floral stalk. The label, written in uneven block capitals, bore the name Mrs. L. Chubb. Yet the handwriting was unlike the usual flowing script of the other entries. It had the same blunt, slightly awkward formation as the word pinned to the effigy, judgment. Perbrite picked it up carefully, turning it over as though it were nothing more than a lost shopping list. The ink had spread slightly into the card fibres, as though written by a heavy hand or a pen poorly trimmed. He placed it back without comment, but filed it in the quiet cabinet of his mind. Later that day, he called upon Mrs. Chubb herself, a broad and practical woman whose approach to gardening resembled military discipline. She met him at her front gate, apron dusted with soil, and assured him at once that she had not written any labels at all. Her niece had filled them in because she had the tidier hand. When asked whether she still had the set of cards, Mrs. Chubb rummaged in her kitchen drawer and produced a small bundle of neatly written labels, all in a rounded, feminine script, nothing like the crude block letters Perbrite had seen. He thanked her, accepted a cup of tea he did not drink, and listened while she complained about unfair judging. Only once did he ask, almost in passing, whether anyone had loitered near her display on the morning of the show. Mrs. Chubb, scowling, said she had seen the solicitor, Mr. Sproul, pacing about like a crow that had lost its corn. She attached no significance to it, but enjoyed the chance to remark on his expression of constant disapproval. Back at the station, Perbrite retrieved the note pinned to the effigy. He set it beside the memory of the crooked label and let the similarity linger. It was not proof, nor even evidence, but rather one of those oddities he had learned to watch for. People revealed themselves, he mused, not only through what they said, but through the small accidents of their habits, the way they wrote a letter, fastened a knot, or misspelled a word. When Sergeant Love entered, arms full of reports from less imaginative constables, Perbrite merely asked him to have a quiet look at who had handled labels at the flower show.
Love blinked, puzzled.
The labels, sir? Yes, they can be very telling. Love, too polite to argue, but too puzzled to nod, carried the instruction away. Perbrite returned to his chair, eyes on the ceiling, the faintest smile playing at his lips. The town might prefer its tidy scapegoats, but he had found a crooked little card that suggested the truth was neither tidy nor finished. Sergeant Love returned from his errands with a notebook filled in his painstaking block letters, each entry a small act of devotion to duty. He stood before Perbrite's desk, tapping the pencil against the paper as though to draw the inspector's attention not only to his findings but to the neatness of their recording. There's quite a few who had the handling of the labels. Sir, he began, squinting to recall without consulting the book. Apart from exhibitors themselves, the committee members were about Mrs. Hatch, Mr. Hopkin, the vicar, and Miss Lucilla Gorse, who seemed to do a good deal of the actual pinning. Miss Gorse, Perbrite murmured, his gaze straying to the window where rain had begun to pattern the glass. Yes, she would. She is diligent in matters that promise influence without responsibility. Love frowned, uncertain whether that was a compliment. And there's the solicitor, Mr. Sproul, he added. Several folk remarked on him fiddling about the tables, said he was measuring bloom sizes, though none could quite tell what business it was of his. Perbrite allowed himself a smile. Mr. Sproul is a man for whom rules are a creed. He cannot resist testing their application, even where none exist. One by one, the sergeant went through his list. There was Mrs. Hatch, who ran the Women's Guild with a ferocity usually reserved for police raids. The vicar, kindly but easily swayed by whichever parishioner had his ear last. And Mr. Hopkin, a retired seed merchant, who carried an air of grievance at no longer being deferred to as an authority. Each name was penciled not only into Love's book, but into Perbrite's widening field of consideration. What struck the inspector most was not any single individual, but the pattern forming among them. Small rivalries, quiet ambitions, and a readiness to see in public disturbance the opportunity for private triumph. The effigy, with its blunt word pinned across its chest, had unsettled more than the town's pride. It had loosened the threads of old tensions, giving them shape and movement. He resolved that the next days must be spent less in examining the scarecrow itself than in watching those who talked about it. He instructed Love to make himself useful in the snug of the Feathers Inn, where gossip came faster than beer, and to listen for mentions not only of outrage, but of satisfaction. Love accepted the mission gravely, as though it were a military campaign. Meanwhile, Perbrite took a slow walk through the town, pausing to greet shopkeepers and nod at housewives who hurried by with baskets. In each face he read something of the disturbance, the eagerness of some to assign blame, the hesitation of others who looked as though they knew more than they wished to say. The crooked label remained lodged in his mind, not as proof, but as a keyhole through which he might glimpse the hand that had set all this in motion. And as the lamps began to glow against the wet dusk, he was quietly certain of one thing. The field of suspects was no longer a field at all, but a garden, crowded with characters whose blossoms, if carefully examined, would reveal the root of the trouble. Morning broke with a washed-out sky, the kind that discouraged both optimism and laundry. The town of Flaxborough, however, had something more substantial than weather to darken its spirits, for, shortly after 9, the gardener of St. Swithin's Church marched into the police station, his cap clutched in one hand and his face a study of both indignation and awe. "They've done it again," he announced, refusing even to sit. "And in God's own yard this time." Inspector Perbrite listened without comment until the man had described the discovery. Another figure, this one strung up to the lich gate itself, its shape stuffed from old cassock cloth and hay, and its paper label scrawled with the word false. Parishioners on their way to the morning communion had scattered like startled starlings. Perbrite set off with Sergeant Love, whose jaw tightened at the notion of the churchyard being turned into a theatre. They found the effigy swaying slightly in the cool breeze, its crude body grotesquely dignified by the ancient stone arch. Unlike the first, this figure bore something more deliberate in its construction. The stitches binding it were neat, almost professional, and its hands had been fashioned into a clasped pose, as though in parody of prayer. The inspector regarded it in silence for some time. Love shifted uneasily. "Looks more like a sermon than a joke now, sir," he said. "Indeed," Perbrite replied softly. "And sermons, Sergeant, are often aimed at a particular listener, even when spoken to many." Within the hour, the square outside the church was filled with speculation. Mrs. Hatch declared it a direct assault on morality. The vicar, pale and perspiring, murmured about blasphemy but seemed more concerned with what the bishop might say. Mr. Hopkins suggested to anyone who would listen that the business smelt of communists, though what he meant by that was left vague. Meanwhile, Miss Gorse stood stiffly by the church gate, her lips pressed thin, watching everything and saying nothing. Perbrite walked among them,
asking no questions but noting the emphasis with which some condemned,
and the restraint with which others withheld opinion. He had learned long ago that the tongue which trembled most to accuse might itself be tied to the guilty hand. By noon, the town's gossip had doubled in intensity. The effigy was carted away, though not before a dozen townsfolk had paused to study its message with the curiosity of those who find in outrage a rare sort of entertainment. Love, still vexed, muttered about tightening watch on the public grounds at night. Perbrite, however, seemed more absorbed in the word itself, false, turning it over like a coin to see which image it might reveal. He returned to his office in thoughtful silence, leaving Love to field the phone calls from indignant parishioners. Sitting back in his chair, Perbrite considered the difference between the first effigy and this second, more artful cousin. One had been a prankster's bludgeon, the other a craftsman's barb. The change suggested not merely repetition but escalation, the work of someone with a plan rather than a grudge indulged. And though he had not yet determined at whom the silent hangman pointed his sermons, Perbrite was sure of one thing: the game had been raised, and the town of Flaxborough would not return to its routines until the hand behind the effigies was revealed. Back in his office, with the drizzle thickening against the panes and Sergeant Love's footsteps fading down the corridor, Perbrite sat in a stillness that was as much deliberate as it was contemplative. He had long since discovered that the pace of the world rarely conspired to solve crimes, and that one must often let silence speak more loudly than statements. The two effigies lay before his thoughts like bookends of some unspoken volume. One coarse and hurried, the other precise, almost reverential in its cruelty. A prankster might manage the first, but only purpose could produce the second. What sort of purpose, though, lurked in Flaxborough's flower shows and parish aisles? Certainly not the grand passions of novels, no desperate love triangles or fortunes to be seized, but the quieter, more insidious motives, envy, pique, reputations guarded as jealously as inheritances. He remembered with mild amusement how the townspeople's indignation carried an undertone of relish. Each indignantly pursed lip or wagging finger betrayed, beneath its outrage, a satisfaction that life had become unexpectedly dramatic. For many, the effigies had provided what the cinema could not: scandal with the added spice of personal implication. Perbrite leaned back, his hands folded over the modest swell of his waistcoat. The words traitor and false revolved in his mind like signs on a village green. They were not random insults. They were indictments, accusations chosen for their sting. And though no name was spoken, the implication was that one was intended, perhaps more than one. He wondered how many in Flaxborough, upon seeing the figures, had felt a sudden guilty prickle, had, for a moment, believed the accusation pointed squarely at them. He thought of Miss Gorse's watchful silence, of Sproul's officious nosing among the exhibits, of Mrs. Hatch's instant appeal to morality as though it were her private patent. Each had looked upon the effigy not merely as object but as message, their faces betraying interpretations more personal than public. Perbrite did not hurry his reflections. He seldom did. The strength of his method lay in recognizing that people, like plants, showed themselves best when left to grow untended. In time, he knew, the guilty hand would falter in its composure, would betray itself in some triviality, a word too eagerly spoken, a correction too hastily made, a denial where none had accused. For now, the town was still in ferment, and Perbrite allowed himself the smallest of smiles. He had often thought that crime in Flaxborough was less a disruption of order than an expression of it, a natural consequence of respectability's tight corset, which sooner or later demanded release. These effigies were no exception. They were the town talking to itself in a darker tongue. And so he waited, watching the rain, until the silence yielded the shape of his next step. It was with the sort of mild inevitability that governed Flaxborough's social calendar that the rector's wife declared her intention to hold a tea party. The pretext was charitable, of course, proceeds for the Mothers' Union, but in truth it was no more nor less than the latest opportunity for the town's notables to measure one another's expressions, to polish their stories, and to ensure their grievances were aired with due ceremony beneath the bunting. Inspector Perbrite accepted his invitation with polite alacrity. He knew that in Flaxborough's drawing-rooms, among sponge cakes and pressed linen, more was revealed than in any police interview. Sergeant Love, dispatched on some errand to preserve his innocence from such parlour manoeuvres, was spared. The rector's house, with its respectable decay and faint smell of hymnals, was crowded that afternoon. Mrs. Hatch dominated a corner with the determination of a general occupying foreign soil. Mr. Sproul hovered near the piano, correcting small inaccuracies in anecdote with a legal precision that no one appreciated. Miss Gorse, tall and unsmiling, positioned herself near the French doors as though guarding the way to decency itself. The rector, fluttering about, smiled too broadly and perspired too freely, while his wife presided with that peculiar calm born of years of reconciling parish rivalries with sponge fingers. Perbrite circulated with a genial slowness, offering compliments that were at once sincere and disarming. He inquired after gardens, after health, after the small matters in which Flaxborough placed its considerable pride. Yet it was not their words, but their glances that interested him most. How Miss Gorse's gaze narrowed when Sproul began expounding upon the effigies as if they were exhibits in a courtroom. How Mrs. Hatch's expression flickered between outrage and relish as neighbours speculated on the culprit. How the rector's hand trembled just perceptibly as he poured. It was over the second round of tea that Perbrite made his move. He placed his cup carefully on its saucer and remarked, with the gentle air of a man idly considering nothing of importance, "Curious, is it not, that the letters upon the second figure were written with such a steady hand?"
Almost as though by someone long practiced in copybooks. A small silence followed, delicate yet telling. Mrs. Hatch shifted in her seat with a harumph, eager to deny but too cautious to volunteer.
Sproul raised his brows and attempted a chuckle, though it came out pinched. The rector dabbed at his forehead, and Miss Gorse, rigid and pale, allowed the faintest betraying glance at her own fingers, clasped tightly about her teacup. Perbrite let the silence breathe, then smiled and moved the conversation to the subject of dahlias. The tension dissolved, or rather, was forced beneath the surface like a weed pressed down by turf. But he had seen enough. The tea party, with its plates of sandwiches and rivers of propriety, had yielded more than a formal interview could have hoped. For beneath the town's laughter and its dainty outrage, the guilty party had trembled, however slightly, and Perbrite, sipping his tea with unhurried satisfaction, knew that the silent hangman's noose was tightening, not around straw but around flesh and conscience. It was in the rector's study 2 days later, the air still faintly infused with furniture polish and dust from old hymnals, that Inspector Perbrite chose at last to speak plainly. The gathering was small, civil, and, like all true moments of consequence, deceptively ordinary. Mrs. Hatch sat stiffly with her handbag on her knees. Mr. Sproul leaned against the mantel as if presiding over a courtroom, and Miss Gorse stood erect by the window, her profile sharp against the fading afternoon light. The rector, poor man, shifted uneasily behind his desk, caught between the roles of host and defendant in his own house. Perbrite, unhurried as ever, poured himself a modest measure of water from the carafe and spoke in the same calm tone with which he might have inquired about someone's roses. The business of the effigies has, I fear, caused considerable alarm, yet I think it has also served to reveal what otherwise might have remained hidden indefinitely. They were not simply pranks. They were messages, personal ones. Sproul gave a dry little cough. Inspector, with respect, the word messages suggests intent. Surely we are dealing here with the work of some disordered mind, not a rational member of the community. Perbrite's smile was faint, but not unkind. On the contrary, Mr. Sproul, disorder seldom manages such neat stitching nor such legible lettering. No, these were deliberate, and from a hand rather more disciplined than the town has credited. He paused, letting his eyes settle briefly on Miss Gorse. A hand accustomed, perhaps to schoolroom copybooks. Miss Gorse's lips tightened, but she did not speak. The inspector continued gently as though reluctant to embarrass. The crooked label on the first effigy was the clue. You see, the pinholes showed it had been repositioned more than once, an uncharacteristic sloppiness for our culprit, who normally insists upon precision.
That little slip revealed that the first was no lone jest, but the rehearsal of a more pointed display. Mrs. Hatch drew in her breath sharply.
"You mean to say that Miss Gorse," Perbrite said, inclining his head slightly towards her, "constructed both effigies out of long-standing resentment, not madness. The accusations, traitor and false, were aimed, I believe, at the rector himself, for reasons which are perhaps best left to the discretion of this room." The rector's hands, clasped upon the desk, trembled slightly. His face coloured, then paled. He made as though to speak, but no words came. Miss Gorse, however, straightened her shoulders, her silence eloquent with both defiance and exhaustion. Perbrite went on, his tone now more grave. Years of service, years of loyalty, perhaps unrewarded. A woman in a parish position may feel herself both indispensable and invisible. Such grievances, left to fester, may finally demand expression. The effigies were her protest, harsh, yes, but bloodless, and, I believe, intended less to destroy than to compel acknowledgment. There was a silence, broken only by the faint ticking of the rector's clock. Mrs. Hatch looked scandalized, but, for once, bereft of words, Mr. Sproul cleared his throat, but finding no opening for pedantry, said nothing. Perbrite rose, adjusting his coat with quiet finality. The matter will, of course, be dealt with in the proper manner, but I suggest that the remedy lies less in punishment than in candour among those most concerned. For now let us say only that the town may rest easier, knowing the hangman has been silenced. He inclined his head to the rector, then to Miss Gorse, and departed without further ceremony, leaving behind a room heavy with realization, embarrassment, and the peculiar relief of secrets at last uncovered in the days that followed. Flaxborough resumed its customary rhythms, though with the faint stiffness of a town recovering from an unexpected stumble. The effigies had gone, but their shadows lingered in conversation, woven into gossip with the same persistence as smoke clinging to curtains. At the Feathers Inn, men who had once spoken of cabbages and cricket now speculated with relish on motives, some insisting that Miss Gorse had been driven by unrequited affection, others that she had secretly aspired to the rector's post itself. The truth mattered less than the satisfaction of a theory tidy enough to pass round with a pint. Mrs. Hatch, affronted at having been so nearly associated with scandal, redoubled her authority within the Women's Guild. She spoke darkly of moral vigilance and suggested with heavy emphasis that certain parish responsibilities ought never to be entrusted again to those without domestic experience. Mr. Sproul denied the opportunity of legal grandeur, muttered instead about the rector's failure to supervise his staff, and made a small but noticeable display of shifting his Sunday attendance to the chapel across the green. As for the rector, he maintained his usual duties with the air of a man both chastened and oddly relieved. He avoided comment, but parishioners observed that his sermons, once bland and rambling, now carried a shade of humility, as if he spoke more for himself than his flock. Miss Gorse remained in her position for the time being, though her presence became at once subdued and conspicuous. Subdued because she no longer sought to direct matters, conspicuous because her very silence invited the scrutiny of those who once ignored her. Through all this, Inspector Perbrite kept his usual quiet watch from the sidelines. To him, the town's reaction was as instructive as the crime itself. Flaxborough had been shown, for a moment, a reflection less flattering than the one it preferred, and now it worked diligently to fold away the incident into the creases of memory where awkward things were kept. Already the effigies were being reimagined in anecdote, less threatening, more theatrical, almost a piece of folklore in the making. Perbrite returned to his desk, to reports and forms and the small, unglamorous duties that sustained order. Sergeant Love, though still inclined to frown at the memory of straw men swinging from respectable arches, accepted that the town was once again content to speak of tomatoes and market prices. On a damp Wednesday afternoon, with the station clock marking the hour, Perbrite closed a file marked Miscellaneous Disturbances and placed it neatly to one side. He sat back, his hands folded, gazing for a moment at nothing in particular. The silent hangman had spoken and been silenced. The town, bruised but intact, returned to itself, its gossip, its